All right. So I'm Kristin Ferrier. I used to run this group a long time ago. I would like to know who's here. Who here is at their first meeting? I see some new people. Is anyone at their first meeting? All right. Welcome everyone to their first meeting. Who's kind of more on the developer side of things? All right. This talk is targeted to you and to DVAs as well. So really quickly, my name is Kristin Ferrier. I have 18 years experience in IT. I'm principal consultant at my own company, Ferrier Solutions. I'm a full stack web developer with a specialty and passion for data. I would love to keep up with all of you guys. You can follow me on Twitter at SQL Energy, and you can keep up with me on Techlahoma Slack at EnergyDev and GitHub at EnergyDev. If you see me at an event sometime and you don't remember my name, but you do know EnergyDev, you can call me that and I will respond to it. That has happened before. All right, also, since we have a lot of developers here, I do want to put in a quick plug for ThunderPlanes for those of you that aren't familiar with it. It is one of the top mobile and web development conferences probably in the region, and it's going to be November 1st, and you can find out more information by Googling ThunderPlanes, and there are going to be 2 different tracks. There's usually a couple hundred people, and it does tend to sell out. And we do have people coming in nationally, if not internationally, to speak. I was actually really excited to get selected to speak this year. I'm actually going to be speaking on the 5 different database families. So go to ThunderPlanes if you can. So let's get started with what we'll cover. We'll talk about how you can use Firebase to build your applications faster. And Firebase is this huge offering by Google. We'll talk about 2 pieces, the Firebase Realtime Database and Firebase Authentication. So let's say you're building your React web app, or you're building an Android app, or you're building an iOS app, or you're building one of these things, and you really, really want to focus on the front end, and you're like, what am I going to use in my database? Well, Firebase offers a real-time database option and authentication that has a lot of built-in features for you that you can use out of the box. So first we'll talk about Firebase Real-Time Database. So first of all, it is a database as a service, so it is a database that's offered in the cloud. It is also a NoSQL database, and inside the NoSQL set of families, there are 4 families, and it is a document database, and the data is stored in JSON. So you use JavaScript in this case, if you're working with a JavaScript application, to pull back the data versus SQL. So here's an example of what some data might look like in an actual Firebase database. So completely different from the table structures that we're used to in SQL. Again, this is a NoSQL database, and it's a document database. In this case, it is storing data as JSON. So we have some users and their IDs, and then some expenses for them. And how do we manipulate the data? Well, if you've got a JavaScript app, then you actually use JavaScript. So this is actually some code here where we're actually adding an expense to a Firebase database. Does anyone see any SQL? There's no SQL in here. It's a NoSQL database. So this portion right here, this database.ref, then that's referring to the users section, then the individual's ID, and then the expenses, and then it's pushing an expense there. So you're using JavaScript to actually put data in a database. Now, one of the advantages with Firebase is you don't have to actually know exactly what your structure is going to be when you get started. Versus in a SQL database, you've got to know what those tables look like before you put any data in them. All right, so validation and security, because like, hey, if your data is out there on the internet in a cloud, someone can bypass your application to access that data. So how am I securing my data? That is super critical. No matter what database as a service that you are potentially using, how are you going to lock down your data? Now, one thing that's important to know with Firebase is even if someone doesn't have the keys that you need to connect your JavaScript application to that Firebase database, there's one piece of information that is discoverable out there that if they have that and you haven't locked down your database, then they could read your entire database. So you do need to make sure that you applied security. So here we have an example here. This is basically a JavaScript object here, which is how basically you can lock down. In this case, we're actually locking down to where a user has to be authenticated, and they can only manipulate data in their section And that's what we're doing right here in the section that's highlighted in red. We're basically saying, hey, you can only read and write to our database in the portion that corresponds to your user ID. And then what we're doing in this next section of red is they're saying, hey, we only want to allow people to add expenses, and they have to fit into this structure of expenses here in JavaScript. So in case someone wanted to add millions and millions and millions of characters into your database, this is a way that you can potentially avoid that by saying you have to have this specific structure. So Firebase does allow you to have the capability for your database to require authentication. You can lock down users to just their section, and you can lock down users to just make sure that they put in data in the way that you want them to. Again, set up security, set up security, set up security. This screenshot here is a picture of the default. They will tell you this, but it's not on the first tab that you see. It's open to everyone when you create that database. So make sure you change the security to not be read-write. Okay, Firebase authentication, we're just going to cover that in a little bit smaller way. So basically, you can use Firebase authentication to have, for example, here on where it says choose an account, Firebase authentication can do that for you. They can do that with an email password, phone authentication, Google, Play Games, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, and anonymous. It can handle all of those different kinds. You just pick which ones you want to use. Now, you can use authentication without the database as well if you just want the information they're getting from that authentication. But here's an example of some JavaScript that you would write if you wanted to have this pop-up come up for you. And it's really just this line here, the firebase.auth.signin with pop-up. And we basically imported the Firebase and Google Auth Provider JavaScript library, basically. And then that allowed us to get this over here by just clicking this button right here. We're able to get this. So Firebase authentication, you can use it on its own, or you can integrate it with Firebase Realtime Database. Couple of awareness items. Pricing plans. These are really important when you're looking at any kind of database as a service offering or other offerings. Getting started can be free. Last I checked, there were a couple of free plans. The one that defaulted starts out free, but if you get to a certain point, they start charging you money, and there's no cap. So be very, very careful about that. Last I checked, there is a free plan with a cap. So always, always look at the plans. If you are looking at using something to where there might not be caps, whether or not it's Firebase or something else, I highly recommend Googling for horror stories where people had those big bills and find out why they had those big bills, because some of them are nice and actually write articles for how to not get those big bills. One caveat, though, on the free plan is that they don't have the automated backups. So they really kind of want, once you're going to use it for professional uses, for you to be on a paid plan. And then Realtime Database does not handle arrays out of the box. You can still use them, but you have to do some things in your JavaScript application to work with them. And really, the biggest key benefit is that you can write your applications more quickly because you've got the database as a service and the authentication as a service. If you want to get started, you can get started at firebase.google.com. And then the second link there is basically an app I have out on GitHub that basically uses Firebase database and Firebase authentication if you want to look at some working code for that. There is a demo for that you can get from that link as well. And that's it. Catch up with me later on Twitter at SQL Energy or Techlahoma Slack Energy Dev. Any questions? Yes, Kimberly. I couldn't hear that question. Offline? I have only done tests with Firebase online, so if they have an off-base functionality, that's not something that I have looked into, but there is some offline functionality with Realtime Database, so that might be possible, but that's not something that I have an answer to at this time. Anything else? All right, thanks. Catch up with me later on Twitter and Slack.